I looked over this PowerPoint the other day with Marianne and noticed that in the very first lines of the English, instead of workshop, I wrote workhop. Workhop would work in another context, but in any case, as I reminded Marianne, in the old days on Ferdowsi Street in the bazaar, dealers, when they dealt with foreign customers, would remind foreign customers if there was a mistake in a carpet, it was done on purpose by the weaver who didn't want to compete with God. So I decided right off the bat to make a mistake so people wouldn't think I was somehow arrogant or thought there was perfection in what I'm doing. In any case, I'm actually not certain what the word workshop is going to mean for us, but we're a small enough group that we can spend more time in exchanging views than in me in an old-fashioned way presenting my views in a one-sided fashion. So I've designed 6 PowerPoint shows with slides that deal with 16 poems by Forugh in 6 numbered contexts. First context is what we think lyric poetry is all about, and we'll look at the poems Joft, Surud Pekar, Ramide, Asir, and Jome. And in the second week, we'll take a look at Forugh and typical poems of hers that deal with Iranian society. I picked 2, Kasi Ke Masl Hich Kas Nist and She'ri Baraye To. In the third week, Farhangi Iran is the context, and we'll look at just one poem, Delan Baraye Baghche Misuzad. Fourth week, Women in Iran, the Khaharam, Halqe, Arusak Kuki, and Ab Tani are the text. And the fifth week, particularly significant in the case of Forugh because she presents herself, or her speakers present themselves as a poet, and we see what most people construe as autobiographical elements throughout her poems. So the fifth week is Zendagi ba Shairi, and we'll deal with a single poem, Tafalodi Digar. The sixth week, we'll focus on the subject of love in Forugh's poems and take a look at the notorious poem Gonah, about which much too much is written, Golasor, and Fataba. Because we're a small enough group, I'm willing to entertain suggestions of other poems that come to mind that you think would fit these categories particularly well. All you need to do is send me an e-message with a poem and a suggestion in this regard. I can't change what I had in mind for us to negotiate in the first session, but we can make any changes we want in further sessions. The PowerPoints will be available after each session in a Dropbox folder. I can get you access to those folders, as you'll hear from Dropbox, if you send me an email, and that'll come immediately. And in the case of, for example, this week, if we don't cover all the slides or all the points I had in mind at the beginning, I'll just reintroduce those slides in next week's presentation if they fit, and we'll move things around as the sessions continue. I could add one other thing about this selection of texts. I didn't select the texts because they were particularly effective poems, particularly appealing, or particularly unappealing. I selected them because they seemed particularly revealing in a discussion of poeticity, in a discussion of poems from an aesthetic perspective, which means if you have a suggestion, I might see that it's a very important poem, but it might not lead to a fruitful discussion about poeticity. The approach that I'm going to be following in analyses of Forug's poems is a formalist approach. And by a formalist approach, I mean an approach which first starts with a text by itself, considered as unique, and tries to elucidate as much of what is going on in the text without reference to anything outside of it. But if in the text there is a reference to Hafez or Tehran or a particular event in Iranian history or culture, that comes into play. But it comes into play secondarily because of the formalist notion that the function of poetry is more often the communication of an experience rather than the communication of knowledge or an ideal or an idea or a position or an argument. Communication of experience. This is the formalist position. I'm not advocating it, I'm using it. So the upshot of our interaction with the poems in the syllabus will be for you to refine what you think about Forug's poems when you read them poetically. It's not my business or my interest in having you read poems the way I'm reading them here. So the first notion is that we're going to think of poems as the expression of an experience. And the experience of the person who says I in the poem, or the observer who doesn't say the word I in the poem. And that can either be Forugh, generally, Forugh on a particular day, or Forugh playing a role, or not Forugh at all. With a formalist reading of a text, that won't be so much of a problem because we're treating it as if we're an island of its own and seeing who the person who says I identifies him or her to be in the poem. A second thing that's going to come into play right away is that although it is traditional in Iranian poetic readings of poetry texts for people to think that lofty ideas or deep ideas or heartfelt emotions or expressions of attachment to culture themselves are sort of poetic, the formalist view does not think of things that don't appeal to the imagination as inherently poetic. So our approach is going to be, one, to read poems to see what experience gets communicated to us, and two, to see how the poet, by appealing to our imagination, sight, sound, smell, things kinetic, metaphor, simile, apostrophe, hyperbole, personification, all these sorts of things contribute to the effects we already have, we already experience, but maybe we haven't defined for ourselves where the experiences come from, or to put it simply and boldly, if you enjoy a poem whose ideas you agree with more than you enjoy a poem whose ideas you disagree with, you probably haven't been reading poetically according to this formalist notion. And you'll notice that in our Iranian tradition of reading poetry, one day we'll go, Omar Khayyam and his pessimism. The next day we'll go, Ferdowsi and his cultural naturalism. That is, we do make adjustments so that things that we don't always believe in our daily lives, we'll take the trip with a particular poet who says things contrary to what other poets say. At the same time, I have to add as a sort of footnote, in Iranian culture, there seems to be a kind of inherent cultural duality in which people can be optimistic and pessimistic depending upon the occasion, can be tradition bound or very modern depending upon the occasion, can be very individualistic or feel as part of a tribe or a group on other occasions. Anyway, that's getting a little bit off track. So we'll start today with looking at the nature of She'r Ghanai and dealing with several Forugh poems. But I want us to start with a poem that's not from Forugh, so we won't have kind of a vested interest. It is a famous poem most of you for sure are acquainted with. If we could look at slide number 6, please. It's not, yeah, number 6.
Do you want a slide number 2 or a 6 from the slide number 1?
Numbered 6.
Okay, let me try to reduce.
You can do number.
I think I need to redo the size. Just give me 1 second.
You can just scroll down from 1 to 6. Communication of experience, appeal to imagination, and the speaker is not necessarily the poet. Those are 3 notions that come with this modern American formalist approach to poetry.
Is it the right slide?
The next one. Can you do the next one?
Next one. Is it large enough to see?
Good. No, you're back to the one before that. They're right there. Good. Chandin Hazar Mard, Chandin Hazar Zan, Zanha Lachak Pasar, Mardan, Ababadush, Yek Bombada Talaba, Lak Lakan Pir, Yek Bog, the Bisafaba, Chand Tak, Barak as Kandaha, Tohiv as Goftaha, Kamish, Yek Bose in the Forba, Av Savs Rang, Chandin Talaka Pir, Bal, to the Holy Sang, and Buha Sa'ilan, Har Adam Dara, Amma Mahas Safid, This is a poem that they refer to as Ta. It's a descriptive kind of poem, a short sketch. What we're interested in is if an experience in this text has gotten communicated to us, how has the poet done that? And I've got a series of questions to the left here, which we're going to ask with respect to most texts. They might seem very obvious to begin with, but since we're treating each poem as something unique and separately from other texts, we're going to act as if we don't necessarily know the context, and we're going to think about the context. So, Zamine Sher, Zaman o Makan Sher, I notice women wearing headscarves or other kinds of head coverings, and the men are in old-fashioned cloaks and turbans. There are beggars along the way. Well, that no longer is. Before I came back to the United States for Iran, I got the impression that beggars were part of Iranian culture. And then when I came back to the United States, I started noticing they're just as numerous here, just as numerous everywhere. So that isn't culture specific. But Yek Bombada Tala, and mosques, domes, gold domes, Mashhad, Shah Abdullah Azim Abdullah, that's Shah
Abdullah Azim, yes.
Abdullah Azim. But I also noticed that Chand Takhtarak and Chandin Kalag appeared by Tudahoya Sang. I didn't get that impression when I went to Ray or when I lived in Mashhad, but I did get an impression when I went to Qom. That is, there seemed to be a lot of space, brown space around things. So well, the title says Qom. Zaviedi de Guyande. Is it a personal speaker? No. Does the speaker have a point of view? We're going to find out, yes, but not personal speaker. And there's no reason for us not to assume it's, as we can assume, that it's close to the poet. No asher, tosifi, ta'limi, ya amuzeshi, ya somehow connected with advice or adage. It's توصیفی, but with a point. درون مایه شعر. Well, I look at the poem and I noticed that the poet had a choice. He could have picked a garden that was Basafa. He could have picked a place that had lots of trees. He could have picked a moment that had people in lines 9 and 10 smiling and talking alike. He could have picked a courtyard pool that people had cleaned just yesterday and had very lively fish in it. And Chandin Kalak appeared by Tu Dahaya sang. And I also noticed there are no verbs in the text. Everything is static. I noticed further that at the beginning, when the speaker says to us, Chandin Hazar Mad, Chandin Hazar Zan, where do you have to be to have the impression that there are lots of people? Probably better if you're a little bit farther away. You're in the stadium, you can't account for what's on your side of the stadium, but you look around and you can see lots of people. So there seems to be direction in this poem. There seems to be farther away vision, and we move closer and closer to the point where we see what the faces are. Is that kind of racial in the sense that there are more Arabs around there? Or is it has to do with class, more rural people, more people who have been in the sun a long time in their daily lives? So I've given some negative examples of negative images instead of neutral or positive images. So the text of the poem and the meaning of the theme of the poem, and Durun Maye or Tem, or Persian equivalents for a technical term in English, which is theme. And theme in English in literary criticism is not a subject. Love is not a theme. It's what the poet says about love. So theme usually means a sentence or two which tells the person you're talking to what the idea is, or what the proposition is, what the attitude of the speaker or poet is toward the proposition of the idea. So this, the implied here, is a sense that at least this specific religious environment, and maybe similar religious environments, maybe the religion themselves, is not inviting, lively, energizing, or what it might be for some other people. Strictly formalist, brief appreciation. And then we have the question, آیا قوم اونطور که هست مورد توصیف قرار گرفته است? Is قوم exactly that way? No. It's different ways for different folks. And I've only been to Qom a couple times, and I've passed through it any number of times, but only a couple times to stop. And one time had a very pleasant lunch with some friends, and had a positive impression of Qom, the two complexes of mosques, very appealing from a distance. Let's look at the next slide, please, the 7th slide. And we'll go right to the left first. Does it have meter? Does it have a pattern of rhythm which is organized to the point where you can scan it? Scan, yani tahqiq badan. Yes, it does. In the transcription of the text, I've indicated that there are combinations in a regular pattern of long and short syllables. Now, in my recitation of the poem, I sort of let the text take us to anything emotional or rhythmic on its own. I didn't add anything. But you'll notice that I'd say a fifth of the syllables in the text are syllables which have which have a medial or final aleph, or aleph at the beginning with a hat, as we say. And an audio lab, acoustic lab, will tell you that ah, a syllable which has ah in it, will take longer to say just normally than a syllable with a, o, and such. The verdict is out on whether automatically a syllable with e takes longer. That is, in English, we can say teeth, but in Persian, we have to say jamshid. That is, the e gets clipped right away if there's another consonant thereafter. But in any case, people will hear this, but they're also going to hear something else. Chandin hazar mad, Chandin hazar sad, sadha lachak fasad, mardan ava badush. That is, they're going to hear a rhythm as well. Our question, and we're not going to have time to answer with respect to this poem, is if you hear a rhythm that's organized, what kinds of stuff does it communicate to you? Is it a decoration? Is it part of the meaning? If it's a decoration, we enjoy it because we enjoy pretty decorations. If it complements the sense of things, we enjoy it for that reason. But one of the aspects of a formalist approach to poetry is that sound is as important as sense. Now, Iranians, whom I've met over the decades, who like Hafez, more often than not, when they're in a group and they're interested in a Hafez poem, they'll take the book of Hafez in their own hands and give it to somebody else and tell the other person to read it. And they have the experience of Hafez when they hear it. At the same time, they're looking to be transported to a realm of ideas or ideals, but hearing it, the sounds of it are extremely important, although I would say most people in Iran don't pay close attention to why sound affects them the way it does, the same way I do, or I used to do before I started taking piano lessons a few years ago. I knew when people were pitchy or off key or on key, and I enjoyed lots of things, but I didn't quite understand how the communication was getting across. So we're going to look at poems and see what Forugh does with sounds and organization of sounds in rhythmic patterns that communicate effects. I listened to a Zoom lecture yesterday, I think it was, on Forugh by an academic, a reputable academic, and the reputable academic read Forugh poems with a declamé sort of reading. And several people in the audience complimented her on this academic reading. I said to myself, well, wait a minute. Suppose Forugh is mulling over in her own mind her feeling of alienation. What's she going to do about her son? What's she going to do about this man she loves who's not her husband? What's she going to do about all the people who dislike her? Is she going to be thinking in a declamé sort of way? And then if you go to Forugh's own readings of her poems, you discover, for example, in Tavallud Digar, that is, you see that she is bold enough to say, I don't have to add anything to the sounds of neutral reading in order for the effects I have in mind to get across. Or let's put it this way. Is it possible in terms of tone in the 21st century for us to read 5 or 6 poems from the same poet the same way? We can, if in fact we make a choice as we begin our reading that this poem by itself, as unique in itself, deserves to be read that way. But I think more often than not, we clear our throats and put on our poetry reading voice and move along. The poet, however, has probably tried to make you read the way he or she has in mind the sounds that come across by choosing a rhythm, by choosing not just an Aruzi rhythm, but by choosing a Vazna Zarbi, which exists in Persian, although people don't discuss it a lot. One other thing about the sound, it has to do with parallel structure. Number 2 on the left, Tarkib Mutavazi, Karine Sazi. That is, parallel structure does an interesting thing psychologically and aesthetically. It's not for nothing that the 2-minute and 10-second pop songs in the English language, ever since the beginning of rock and roll, have verses that are a third of it, that kind of a bridge in the middle, and then has those verses that were a third of it at the beginning and kind of toward the end as well. It appeals to our expectation fulfillment sense. That is, if a poet gets you to expect something by doing something more than once, and then does it, we like that. It's appealing. It's pretty. It's fun. And if the poet, the second or third time, doesn't fulfill our expectation, that gives more emphasis to what the poet did the second time. In other words, the poet can take us down a street with one kind of building and then introduce another kind of building, and we'll be affected by that. And what has the poet done orally, A-U-R-A-L-O-Y and all this? He has done something indirectly. He hasn't told us what to feel. He showed us something that leads us to feel something. Gauthier, the same way. There are lots of interesting rhymes in his poems that are unobtrusive. Sad and pack. First line, and we have to go halfway through the poem. Douche and chamouche. Tala and safa. Siah and ra. Rang and sang. We hardly notice, we notice in terms of emphasis, but we hardly notice in the way we notice monorhyme in a ghazal by Hafez. And we can assume, if in a rhyme, the words that are rhymed because the poet was hunting for a rhyme, that's decoration, it might be fun. But suppose we assume that maybe a word in first position or last position has emphasis by position. And if a word is rhymed with another word, it gets another kind of emphasis. Well, if we go through this poem and look at the words that are rhymed, we see that they're particularly significant words. We talked about Gozinesha Josiata Tosifi, that is, Naderpur, who was a non-religious person, an anti-formal religious person from youth, but he's a poet, which means he's not going to preach to us. He's not going to have a gratuitous assertion. He's going to take us on the trip that artists take. By the way, something else I could add here. Is the world of this poem the world of phenomenological reality, the world we perceive? Is it an imaginary world, or is it the world of art? I vote for door number 3, world of art, because we recognize pieces of the real world. It's not even surrealistic. It's not abstract. It's not expressionistic. It's pieces of the real world, but they're put in an order that we associate with poetic, with artistic expression. That is, the details are chosen in such a way. So that leads us to conclude that the tone of the speaker, the Lahn Guyande, is subjective by virtue of the choosing of these negative images. The experience of the speaker was this trip in his mind, perhaps based on a trip he took, that he then presents in such a way that we'll have the same sort of experience, even if we're devoutly religious, which is one reason why it's sort of foolish for governments to censor poems. That is, Naderpur's poems don't usually appear in poems, don't usually include in Iran the poems from 1980 on, but they don't include someplace like Qum. There's a poem like Qum, which is unnecessary because the world of art doesn't ask us to do anything more than experience things there. Let's go now to slide number 3. famous passage from Milton's Paradise Lost. Adam is talking. He's talking about God, who closed his eyes but let his mind stay open. And meanwhile, he pulls out a rib from Adam's side and fashions it into Eve. Let's say the second most important event in human history in biblical terms, or the most important, but it came second chronologically, if we believe this sort of story. And it's typical Milton verse in Paradise Lost. But notice the one line, wide was the wound. This is when Adam's rib gets taken out of Adam's side. And Adam, who's seeing this in his mind's eye, says, wide was the wound. What's happened there? 4 little words. The wound was wide. Da-dun, da-dun. We take wide and put it in the beginning. We take wound and put it at the end. Instead of having da-dun, da-dun, we have da-da, da-dun. 4 little monosyllabic words. And what does your mouth do when you say the word wide? I mean, this is kind of a throwaway line. He did thousands of lines like this. And I picked this thing from a foreign text to make it very graphic to us if we have never heard of this, how it is that poets get an effect by having an expectation. We have a grammatical expectation, subject plus verb plus predicate, nominative, predicate, adjective, or object. And now we reverse it. And then we have, in Alexander Pope's An Essay on Criticism, true ease in writing comes from art, not chance. Of course, he's being didactic here, but his verse, it's got a lot in it. 'Tis not enough, no harshness gives offense. The sound must see an echo to the sense. Soft is the strain when zephyr gently blows. That's a soft line. And a smooth stream in smoother numbers flows. We can't get into how it is he achieved this, but I can't read it in a way that doesn't give me soft and smooth. When loud surges lash the sounding shore, the harsh, rough verse should, like the torrent, roar. He did it again. Hafez does this from morning till night. Ferdowsi does it every day. We read, we have an experience, we appreciate it, but maybe we're not self-conscious about how much is getting across by the sense. When Ajax strives some rock's vast weight to throw, the line too labors and the words move slow. Monosyllabic words, long vowels, etc. Let's look at slide number 9. I'm in my previous life, by this time, a student would have picked up a newspaper and started reading. Somebody else would have yawned. Somebody was shaking his head saying no. 4 people interrupted. I don't know how to get interaction or have a field full of responses. If you had a button that muted me when I've gone too long on something, I wouldn't mind that. In any case, جفت شب میآید و پس از شب تاریکی و پس از تاریکی چشم‌ها، دست‌ها و نفس‌ها و نفس‌ها و نفس‌ها صدای آب که فرو می‌ریزد قطره 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 از شیر. بعد 2 نقطه سرخ از 2 سیگار روشن، تیک تیک ساعت و 2 قلب و 2 تنهایی. This is Aldo Rowe's pad of poems. It's a descriptive sketch, but it's not a description of an object. It's a narrative. So the description is of a moment or several moments. So we probably say it's as much ravayati as tosifi. It's as much narrative as descriptive. Zaviyedi de guyande ya ravi. It is a ravayat غیر شخصی دانای کل. When we have a speaker who's not an I or a you, the speaker can tell a story without getting into the minds or feelings of a character. getting into the minds and feelings of one character, or one character at a time, or all the characters. We read novels and we don't stop and think about how a novel wouldn't work if it had a personal speaker, and how another novel wouldn't work if it didn't have a personal speaker. But we can do the same thing with poems as well. So which one are we going to choose here? I would just say on the basis of one word, we know it's a omniscient speaker, Tanhai. They're still in bed together. They're still next to each other. But the speaker, who hasn't been identified as a person, is telling us what's in their heads, so to speak. How about the verb? Of course, the subject of the poem is sexual intercourse, and sexual intercourse we can associate with physical pleasure. We can associate it with intimacy. We can associate it in love with physical pleasure associated with intimacy that verifies, enhances, cements, adds to the feeling of togetherness. There's a whole range. And we're interested in what this experience is. No dynamism to the text, even though it's the activity described is very physical, very active. There doesn't seem to be any dynamism. The even the nafasa is as if there's kind of even though the heavy breathing, so to speak, at the same time, it's just a repetition of the breathing. The rhythm of the text seems to be consonant with, seems to be in line with what's going on in the text. I don't ask for the theme here, but what is the theme and how did we get there? So nighttime, darkness. And remember, if we want to look ahead to that over talked about poem Gonal, two consenting adults, as far as we know, in privacy. So we can wonder what the sin is in the context of this representation, but they may have had more on their minds. It would have been better for them had they had different conclusions to experience. Hands, faces, hands, breathing, the sound of water from a faucet nearby. Maybe that tells us it's in a hotel sort of room rather than a bedroom where the bathroom will be separate. Had two tips of cigarettes glowing in the dark. Where is the speaker? If you are lying next to someone and you're both smoking a cigarette, are you going to see the tips of the cigarette? Are you going to see the redness? Probably not. So this disembodied speaker is somebody who, by virtue of our suspension of disbelief, agreeing to accept what starts out as something that is being seen in an unrealistic way, we accept the reality of what follows. Tika saat. I think two people in love who have sex and then are side by side in bed, they're not going to hear if their clocks have sounds. They're not going to hear it. They're not going to hear any sounds. They're still in whatever the world of intimacy or love. The dokal, that is, if they were mystics, their hearts would have been one. If they were wholeheartedly in love, even on an earthly way, their hearts would have been love. Their hearts would have been one. Now let's move out of the poem for a second. Who is the person behind this speaker? It's Forugh herself. And this, again, is a world of art, but behind it, there may be the world of reality that Forugh, as a woman, may have had occasions where she had an intimate relations with someone and maybe wanted it to mean something or to cement their relationship or be unspoken love talk, and it turned out not to be that way, that she may have been in this sort of situation. Can we do this since I'm doing all the talking? If anybody has a comment or two about things to this point, if you'd like to jump in now, please. I don't know how to do it, but I think your hand being raised will do something. Uh-huh.
Can I ask a question, Doctor?
Uh-huh. Yes.
I don't see anywhere in the poem where she says I. Could it be that she's watching somebody, a sister, a neighbor, when she, especially when she says the روشنی دو تا سیگار, it implies that she's looking at a distance, two people smoking. Maybe she's watching two other people going through this experience and feeling for them that they're really together, but they're really alone.
Uh-huh.
Maybe there are two other people.
For sure, the observer is somewhere else and can see from a distance what's going on. I suggest that it is a modern yeki bud yeki nabud. That is, when we learned stories as kids, when our parents said yeki bud yeki nabud, we put everything out of our heads and we were going to believe the story that started. We didn't have to connect the story to our everyday reality outside. So when I said suspension of disbelief as a possible context for this poem, I'm more thinking that she is just starting us off as an impersonal speaker who gives us this scene and pursues the scene. If you have her watching from a distance, she could be in the first scene of a Law and Order rerun where on television, where somebody is a peeping Tom looking at somebody else's apartment across the way and sees a murder or something. So I don't think we need to go there. I think we just set this as a premise of art, that the poem begins and we're used to accepting its beginning. Now, if the poem begins with a general conclusion or a general assertion, we might not accept it. We're going to see a poem, Arusaka Kuki. Those of you, I guess most of you have read it. Where does she mention the phrase Arusaka Kuki in the poem? It's the title, but she doesn't mention the phrase to the very end of the poem, by which time we've met these different kinds of women and they have a common denominator. They're like a wind-up doll that the menfolk can wind up and get them to do what they're supposed to do in society. So your point is well taken. Yes, observer sees the red tips and what have you. But I think we can just say that she may have had this experience. That's not necessary. She reimagines it and she presents it not from her perspective, but from this from this reality of art. Any other comments at this point? Yes, sure. Yes.
Actually, it just came to my mind she could have been watching herself in the mirror across the bed.
Well, there are those hotel rooms where they put mirrors on top, on the ceiling. I don't know. When we read the poem, at the beginning of the poem, our mind has any number of avenues we can pursue. I say, entertain them all. And then as the poem moves along, you leave one avenue aside, another avenue aside. So at the very end, you're probably left with a single avenue. People can disagree with that single avenue, but poets are in the communication business. They don't want you feeling a way different from what they had in mind. They don't want you to be thinking things that they didn't have in mind. If we can explain something in a simpler way in a poem, that probably is more reasonable to pursue. But anyway, let's leave that as a question. Remember, when we own a poem, we can do with it what we will. Our only problem is ultimately if we want to persuade other people of how we think, or we want to be a critic and say what actually is going on, we have to use certain kinds of literary critical methods and devices. Let's look at...
Hi, I have a question as well.
Sure.
I have a question about the title of the poem. It is Joft, which is doesn't mean anything romantic, or it's just the relationship between physical relationship between two.
Very good. You have to decide if a title is part of a poem or not.
Yes.
Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Hafez's poems don't have any titles. That is, we have to think about that. If she has chosen this title deliberately, as she presumably did, she was implying that we should think of Joft in an animal sense, not just describing what could be people turning into a romantic couple. And T.S. Eliot has the famous line in his poem Four Quartets, where he talks about he goes to a place where his 17th century ancestors were there, and he talks about the people there coupling. Well, in English, when you use the word coupling, it only refers to the physical act. It's the same word you use if you were talking about animals. So he was kind of saying the people in that time, lots of people weren't very spiritual. They just plodded through life, and coupling was one of the things. So yours is a very good observation. You can mull it over and see what you want to do with it. Let's look at slide number 10. One more. Slide 11.
This is 10.
Oh, that's it? No, the one I have on the screen is, or maybe it's a different number there. 12.
12.
It's the one after the one you just shown. No, it's the one before that.
11.
Yeah, good. Here's a church, a village church in Maine. And we'll forget about the architect and what experience he's communicating. And then we have a famous Maine painter who has done a painting of the church. Now, this Maine painter, I know from seeing early works of his, could draw the church exactly the way it is in the left slide. But here's what he did. Is he adding anything to our knowledge of religion? Is he adding anything to our knowledge in general? Is he making a point? No, he's giving us his experience of church. It's country. It's folksy. It's got a kind of a vitality and movement to it. There may even be something a little bit more innocent to it or more childlike. If we ever have a next time when we can go to Paris, the next time you go to Paris, be sure to go to the Picasso Museum and go through the first two rooms, which has Picasso drawing and painting. If you could draw and paint that way in the first two rooms, you'd retire after showing those paintings. And in the third room, you suddenly realize he's in the experience business now. He knows how to do things in an absolutely realistic way, but he wants to get us what his experience of women is, what his experience of still life objects and everything else is. I think this is a classic painting showing how it is that word pictures in poems may give us the same sorts of experiences as this painting gives us. Let's look at the next one. Anything we don't accomplish in one session, I'll integrate into the next session. When I talked about the world of art, as opposed to an imaginary world, as opposed to the world of everyday reality, I have 5 examples here. Seperi's painting in the bottom left. Are there any blue trees near Kasha? Not that I know of. He has given us his impression, his experience of a building with trees. Of course, remember those Chan Tak Darak? They were negative. Here they're positive. So he's taken us into the world of art where he sees the warmth of the door, inviting maybe, and the trees as being as warm as blue can be. How about the upper left? Mazra Sabza Falaki Dano Dosti, etc. Zenderudi's painting. He was commissioned by Mage Publishers to do 18 paintings for 18 Hafez poems. And here's one he did. There's a moon in it. There's a poem about moon and fate and summing up our lives. Is it an imaginary world? No, it's the real world of a stenographer of Hafez's poem. It's the world of art of giving us an impression of the moon. And here he's giving us an experience of both the substance of Hafez's poem, and he's giving us his experience of Hafez's poem as a poem. But he's a painter, so he does it this way. Badri Borghi. Badri Borghi, anytime you're homesick for Iran and you don't want to look at pictures of the real Iran you're homesick for, you want to look at pictures of the Iran you remember in your imagination growing up in, Google Badri Borghi. She does those moments in everyday life, weddings, picnics, Nowruz, Khastagari, all kinds of things. And they're real objects and they're real events. Does she present reality the way it is in the real world? No, there's no single point perspective. It's a modern version of the painting of miniature world. Just one other comment with respect to Nasser Ovisi's painting there to the right. Damavand, Persepolis, caparisoned horses ready to lead the charge. And he's saying in the year 2006 or whatever it was, we don't have any horseback riders left. We've got all this inspiration and this glory from the past. The horses are ready, but we're not doing anything about what? It could be political, historical, cultural. The next slide, please.
Sorry, you didn't go over Parviz Kalantari picture.
Okay, Parviz Kalantari. We're going to extend this program till I'm free till December 5th. The way I'm going, there's going to be a problem with that. Is that a real world we recognize? Yes. Do people do those kinds of things? Yes. But what has he done with the lines? What has he done with the perspective? What has he done with the geometric shapes? He has turned a world of reality into a real world of art. Nobody confuses this with a photograph, but everybody has an experience of what he sees. Now, I don't know that Kalantari had much experience in architecture, but he played with forms and shapes, geometric shapes, throughout his whole career. He had other kinds of paintings, his paintings of mosques in the brown distance and other sorts of things, but this was one of his. Apparently, when I went to bazaars and went inside some mosques or other kinds of settings where there were people and buildings, he had this sort of experience. Are all these pretty pictures? Remember, not all paintings or poems have to be pretty in a kind of a conversational sense, but there's no ugliness here. But it is a world of art nonetheless, which the expertise and craft of the artist has made pretty in another way. Is that a little bit of an answer to that? The next slide.
Yes, thank you.
Would somebody like to read this poem? I'm thirsty and my voice is going. Who'd like to recite this poem?
علی جان میخوای بخونی شما؟ علی آماده نیستی؟
سلام، من بخونم؟
اگه آماده ای
به شعر فارسی رو بخونم؟
آره.
بله، مرسی. سرود پیکار از فروغ فرخزاد. تنها تو ماندی ای زن ایرانی، در بند ظلم و نکبت و بدبختی. خواهی اگر که پاره شود این بند، دستی بزن به دامن سرسختی. تسلیم حرف زور مشو هرگز، با وعده های خوش منشین از پای.
There's a mistake in the next line. It should be
خیلی بشو.
سیلی بشو.
سیلی بشو ز نفرت و خشم و درد، سنگ گران ظلم بکن از جای. آغوش گرم توست که پرورده این مرد پر ز نخوت و شوکت را. لبخند شاد توست که می بخشد بر قلب او حرارت و قوت را. آن کس که آفریده دست توست، رجحان و برتریش تو را ننگ است. ای زن به خود بجنب که دنیایی در انتظار و با تو هماهنگ است. زین بندگی و خواری و بدبختی، خفتن به گور تیره تو را خوشتر. زین بندگی و خواری و بدبختی، خفتن به گور تیره تو را خوشتر. کو مرد پرغرور بگو باید، زین پس به درگه تو بساید سر. کو مرد پرغرور بگو برخیز، که اینجا زنی به جنگ تو میخیزد. حرفش حق است و در ره حق هرگز، از روی ضعف اشک نمیریزد. حرفش حق است و اسلحه‌اش هم حق، فریاد خشم و درد به لبهایش. با مرد پرغرور بگو این زن، زین دایره برون نکشد پایش.
اشتباهی. And the next slide.
امیدوارم درست خونده باشم.
بله. هویت گوینده. Who's talking?
A woman.
Aki. Oh, yeah. Is Forugh talking? Is an unidentified speaker talking?
I think unidentified speaker. Yeah, I'm correcting myself. I think there is no clue that the speaker is a female.
Okay.
The speaker sending messages to female, but there is no clue that the speaker is a female.
Okay, and the speaker seems to present, we'll say she, just because we have to use a pronoun in English, a personal pronoun. The speaker seems to imply that she's speaking for more than herself, that she kind of represents a point of view. And I think most of us would nod and say, yeah, we're on board, so to speak, even 50 or 60 years later. Who is the addressee? هویت مخاطب.
Doctor, before that, I think not only she's expressing herself and her pain, I think she's also generalizing it to all the other people that she sees or that there might be out there and she doesn't know.
Okay, good.
The common pain.
Okay, good. So one, we're saying that she represents lots of people. She's not arguing a case she thinks people will disagree with. She's arguing a case which she thinks people will agree with. And then the speaker is also included in that group of women or others out there. زمینه شعر، زمان و مکانش, it's today, but today is the 1950s now. It's contemporary. Present tense appears. Situation is contemporary. How about number 3? The correctness of the speaker's views.
I think it's very subjective. We need lots of contextual information to be able to say, is it right or wrong? I mean, I'm an Iranian, so I know I have lots of information about the society and that in that era. But let's imagine someone who is not familiar with the power dynamic of Iranian families and Iranian society. So it's subjective.
Good. For sure, we see it's subjective. Remember, from the formalist perspective, I'm suggesting that we first just take poems on their face, internal value, and then we move outside the poem. This is a poem when she says Zane Irani. That's a context. We have to go there at some point, but we're interested in the poem itself and the reliability of the assertions. Is it true that Tanha Zanhay Iruni in Masail Ruburu Hastad? Is it true that Tanha Tomondi e Zani Iruni that band Zomu Nekbato Bad Bakti? Is that true?
To some degree, it may be true, but I don't think so. I think this is a very general issue. I mean, I'm a man, but I know, and also I look at it both ways. There are men that could be the women in a certain relationship. So there'll be, but in general, I think they're everywhere. But maybe she's addressing the Iranian women to tell them, you know, they're behind, maybe. But there are others like them everywhere.
Okay, that we can at least say that it is very hyperbolic, very exaggerated, and literally untrue. In other words, if I'm going to accept what she says as truth, I'll be like my mother when I was a child and I told my mother I'm unhappy, and my mother, without asking me what happened that you're unhappy, would immediately get unhappy herself because I was unhappy. But in an art exchange, in order for me to feel the same way as the speaker has to provide the grounds or the details or the sights and sounds and colors for me to get to where he or she was. So I begin from the very first line of this text, from a formalist perspective, to think that the text is not living up to one of the usual ways in which a speaker gets readers to share an experience the speaker has had personally or has had because of reading or observing other people and the like. And that leads me to number 4, tajribeh intiqali dar she'r. That is, what is the experience that's being communicated? For me, and we could have a long conversation here, but this is not a typical Forugh poem. For me, the only experience that gets communicated is an experience I don't necessarily consider poetic. It's the experience of her anger, in the speaker's anger and indignation and interest in getting things changed. And in fact, there, in rhetorical terms, I see a problem. And that is, can anybody identify in the text, what is it specifically that the speaker wants Iranian women who are in this state of subjugation to do? What does the speaker want Iranian women to do? Long and short of it, she doesn't say. That is, there are no specifics. They're all metaphors and similes and things symbolic. In fact, half the things come from a kind of a diction associated with traditional Persian poetry. I don't want to sit in judgment of this text. When I read it from a formalist perspective, I think number 6, it approaches sha'ar or sho'ar more than it inhabits the place called she'r. I'm not going to argue the case, but that's an impression. Farrokhzad left the Khaharam, Surud Peykar, and 1 or 2 other early poems out of Asir and Divar collections, I think because she had the same feeling about them. She had a heartfelt thing to say. She was impatient, frustrated with what she saw around her, but she didn't have the time or the motivation or the skill at that point to turn them into poetic expressions. That expression, that brings into play this paragraph on the left, which you can look at your leisure. فاصله زیباشناختی, aesthetic distance. For art to work more often than not, the artist has to be able to achieve a certain distance from the emotion and the emotional event or experience that the artist wants to turn into art. William Wordsworth famously said, poetry is the overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility. In other words, for us to do good art out of things, I can remember as a teenager writing poems, romantic poems, except one word in that phrase wasn't correct, poem. They weren't poems. They were kind of autobiographical romantic statements. Why? Because I didn't have the kind of distance to enable me to figure out what it would be in the text that would make readers feel the same way I feel, except for my mother, that is, without me giving detail. So that's for something for us to bear in mind. Now, lots of critics of Forugh have said, she's too personal. That's irrelevant. Whether you're too personal, impersonal, doesn't make any difference. It's what you do with the personal stuff. And in her poems that are first-rate poems, she has achieved an aesthetic distance. Emotional situation, she reviews it, she turns it into a poem, but she creates that distance so she is both the poet and the person undergoing experience, and that gets across to us. How about slide 15 and 16?
Okay.
It's going to be Rami Day. And could I have another volunteer to read Rami Day, please?
I can read.
Good.
رمیده. نمیدانم چه میخواهم خدایا، به دنبال چه میگردم شب و روز، چه میجوید نگاه خسته من، چرا افسرده است این قلب پرسوز. ز جمع آشنایان میگریزم، به کنجی میخزم آرام و خاموش. نگاهم غوطه ور در تیرگی ها، به بیمار دل خود میدهم گوش.
به بیمار دل خود.
به بیمار دل خود میدهم گوش. گریزانم از این مردم که با من به ظاهر همدم و یک رنگ هستند، ولی در باطن از فرط حقارت به دامانم 200 پیرایه بستند. از این مردم که تا شعرم شنیدند، به رویم چون گلی خوشبو شکفتند، ولی آن دم که در خلوت نشستند، مرا دیوانه بدنام گفتند. دل من، ای دل دیوانه من، که می سوزی از این بیگانگی ها، نکن دیگر ز دست غیر فریاد، خدا را بس کنی دیوانگی ها.
Here's a poem that's always struck me as having half of the aesthetic distance that might have existed in, but for sure it's a poem. For sure it works. It just obliges us to fill in some of the gaps, if you will. That is, we have to extrapolate from the text that she sees herself or she is a poet. But we also have to imagine what about her personality has caused people to talk as they do behind her back. In other words, we're not sure, we may not have enough evidence to understand the opprobrium, the disapproval of other people. There was plenty of evidence there in her life for people who were inclined to disapprove of her, even if that's irrelevant in terms of appreciating art. The artist's personal life, you may not invite the artist to dinner. I wouldn't invite Picasso to dinner. I didn't think he was a nice guy. I didn't think Ernest Hemingway was a nice guy, but I sure would read and look at everything they did. why my passionate heart is sad in the first stanza, my ailing heart. I know what به دامانم دوصد پیرایه بستن means, but I've never heard it in conversation. Does any of you use it? So پیرایه originally is a kind of an extra added decoration, right? And this means negative things that are kind of put on your metaphorical clothes that redound to your disapproval. Anybody have a comment about the texture of the phrase?
یا آقای دکتر پیرایه means از پیراستن به معنی کم کردن یک چیزی برای زیباتر کردنش. مثلا به مردان پیرایشه، اینا مو رو میزنن تا قشنگ بشه، ولی برای مثلا خانم‌ها آرایه هست، خب یه چیزی اضافه میکنن like میکاپ، یه چیزی اضافه میکنن که زیبایی بیشتر بشه. بنابراین پیرایه یعنی یه چیزی رو کم کردن.
کم کردن باید okay. But it really is a couple hundred criticisms, a couple hundred insults, isn't it?
در اینجا به هر حال اصطلاح دیگه، به دامان کسی پیرایه بستن. البته من خب نمونهشو خیلی شاید کم دیده باشم. پیرایه بستن معمولا به دامان کسی چیزی بستن، ولی پیرایه من نشنیدم، نمیدونم.
اوکی. از این مردم که تا شعرم شنیدن به رویم چون گلی خوشبو شکفتن، ولی آن دم که در خلوت نشستن مرا دیوانه ای بدنام گفتن. How do we get to experiencing her as دیوانه or badnam on the basis of what's in the text? Any clues? She's on the right train. She knows where she wants to go as an artist. She hasn't figured out all the gears, all the things that she might take advantage of to make the trip an aesthetically pleasing trip, 100% pleasing to her readers. We have no problems understanding what's going on, but if we want to go beyond understanding to the experience, she's left out a couple things. Again, the proverbial mother. You tell your mother, they're calling me crazy and they're calling me a bad person because of my poems. That's enough for your mother. But for us as formalist readers, it might not be enough. Let's go to a text where that is an issue. Let's see what I had on the next page. Page 16. The next slide. Yeah. گوینده اول شخص مفرد okay. ساختار دو بیتی های متوالی. There's a problem with quatrain sequence poems that Forugh realized halfway through her second volume of verse. Who came up with these quatrain sequence poems? Remember, we have quatrains all over the place in traditional Persian poetry, but we don't have quatrain sequence poems until the 20th century. Who came up with them? The women folk or the men folk? The men folk. Who came up with verse forms in general, with poetic diction in general, with El Ma'aruz? Who came up with all this stuff? The men folk. So Forugh, from the beginning of her career, realized that for her to produce poems with her own signature, her content was going to change. It wasn't going to be Nima Yushij talks about his frustration and does what? He turns the happy person into a turtle, and he's looking at the turtle. He finds something in nature and creates an objective correlative. Forugh just rushes right in. This is what is going on in my life, and here's how I feel about it. The next stage, which Ramideh doesn't illustrate. Remember, if you have quatrain sequence poems in perfect meter, in perfect rhyme, how upset can you be? That is, the form suggests that something about the world is in order, even if your content isn't that way. So what does she do? When she gets to the second part of the volume Divar, she starts having lines of unequal lengths in her poems. She's not involved in a Nima Yeshid's revolution. She's doing her own thing. And then she starts having incomplete or not wholly regular patterns of meter. She starts not having rhyme schemes or irregular rhyme schemes. But the poetry is actually becoming more effective in the communication of experience. So she's using other things in language in order to compensate for these pleasing things that have been part of tradition. There is Vazna Aruzi, there is Qafiye, a lot of repetition of vowels and consonants, that is alliteration and assonance. There is repetition of words, that is expectation fulfillment involves this pleasant feeling we get when a word gets repeated. People like Hafez, when they repeated a word in the same line or in two lines, they had the word usually have two different meanings. So he's getting involved in iham and other sorts. So negah, negaham, nigorizam, gorizanam. That is the second time we hear one of these words. There's an echo. She's in the crafty business. Estare tashbih. What is the motive, getting to number 5, what is the motive of friends and acquaintances of the speaker? We don't know, do we? This for me is an aesthetic missing link. I enjoy this text. I have feelings as a result of reading this text, but the feelings are more, you read a newspaper article about a tragedy. You get sad? Yes. You read a poem about a tragedy. Do you get sad because of the tragedy? No, you get sad because of the experience that the poet has made of the tragedy. In fact, the poet might make the tragedy comic. There's an interesting event in English literature that people often wrote after the Civil War in America. Photography and newspaper articles talking about how horrible war was. But people still had this notion that war was noble. Then in World War I, in the middle of World War I, where 1 in 9 men in Europe died, they say, several English poets started writing poems about the war they were in. And they were horrifying poems. It wasn't that the stuff was horrifying that got to readers. It was that the experience of war that readers felt once they read the poem was horrifying. And it really changed how the intellectual class, who used to think there was some nobility in war, an artistic class felt about war. So we buy the theme, but we have this question. Let's get to a poem that...
I have a question.
Sure.
Sorry. One question is, it seems that she's different from the people who are around her. And that is the point of the poem that I get, that even people pretend that they are close to me, but they are different from me.
I have a very interesting anecdote. Multiple times in the past, I've been invited to give talks at Iranian American medical conventions. And usually after the talk, one or more physicians will come to me and reach into his vest pocket. And I know what's coming. It's his latest poem. I'm all for medical school. I believe all my doctors all the time. And I open it up, and here's this leading oncologist who's standing there waiting for me to say something. And so I'm like these people, the public side, I say, I think it's absolutely remarkable that you've found time to engage in artistic enterprises with your heavy schedule. But in private, that's just a matter of being polite. Why do I have to say that the poem doesn't work? That's sort of irrelevant. But here, and in private, I would say, well, poems usually do this, that, or the other thing. But in this situation, I think you're absolutely right, but what you're suggesting is that we have to do a little bit of the poetry writing ourselves to fill in the gaps. Remember how Naderpour did qom? He didn't leave it up to us. He gave us a qom. We can agree or disagree, but he gave us that experience of qom. She's given us how she feels. She's given us the experience of feeling alienated, but she hasn't given us motivation of the response. Suppose somebody said to me, because I lived in Iran for 6 years, somebody said to me, that's not the way they reacted to Forugh. Everybody loved her. I would say, are you kidding me? Every day somebody said something negative about Forugh. Well, I would have my own evidence to deal with that gratuitous and false assertion. But in a poem, the evidence has got to be there, or somebody could think, oh, I never run into negative impressions of her.
Okay, thank you.
This poem is fun to read. And I use fun in a technical sense. It's enjoyable to read. You do take a trip. I'm just saying that the poetry trip usually has more stations, or has more speed, or has something that this particular train doesn't have.
So I do have a comment, Dr. Hillman. So here she's saying the jam آشنایان می‌گریزم. She's not using the frame. She's not saying the jam دوستان می‌گریزم. And then I want to link this to the to the second poem that we just reviewed. I think it was the name of Jove. She was talking about the دو قلب دو تنهایی. So being loneliness, being lonely. I guess she chose the word accurately. I mean, she was emphasizing to use this word, آشنایان, not دوستان.
Okay, good.
Is it a true comment?
Yes, but we still want to know, as poetry readers, why do Ashnayan think that way and talk behind her back that way? And we have to leave the poem in order to find evidence that will support what she said. We want to leave the poem when if somebody uses the word Rustam in a poem, that gives us the whole world of Rustam outside in Ferdowsi, and that increases the breadth and color of the poem. But when somebody just implies that something is going on in society, and you can think of other people in society with a different view, then the poet's left up to you something that the word Rustam doesn't leave up to you. You can't impute to Rustam things that are not in depictions of Rustam in literature or in society when you bring the word into a poem. But as you can't say his father killed him. No, that was Rustam who killed his son. Anyway, I don't mean to make a big deal out of any of these. The big deal is the process and why it is we may have more intense feelings of aesthetic pleasure when a poem does the sort of things we associate with effective poetry, and we may not appreciate that we've sensed that sort of thing. Let's look at...
Can I ask one more question about this poem? Did she choose this language, which appears to me very formal, like in terms of the words, and also like you talked about the form? Did she do it on purpose, or is it just what she was familiar with or comfortable with at the time? Because to me, it feels like the formality of the language creates this distance between me and her pain, or it makes it kind of, I don't know, just romantic and sentimental, but not very tangible and raw.
That's a really significant observation that lots of critics don't pay attention to. As for her doing it deliberately, when I got to Iran, I didn't know any Persian. I couldn't read a lick, so I picked The Blind Owl as a text to learn how to read with. A month later, people were saying to me, why are you so depressing? Why do you talk about all this negative stuff? I had learned the words. That is, my diction was the diction of I read that. I read Ferdinand Historia Forugh. I read 2 or 3 other, and some Ionic quatrains. Whenever I talked about ideas, those were the words, and the words have these kinds of attitudes behind them. So I don't think she did it deliberately. When she had a feel for poetry, what was she going to do? She had to read poems. And what poems could she have read? Remember, Ahmad Shamlu's Padiyar wasn't out yet. That was 1957. In Bufakur, yes, when when the narrator quotes other characters, they speak in colloquial Persian, but there was no tradition of colloquial Persian in poetry. Baba Tahir has a couple of things in dialect that have happened. Your question, which remains unanswered in the field, is why don't Persian poets use the language they speak? We've got Zaban Adabi, Zaban Ketabi و نوشتاری، زبان محاوری و گفتاری، زبان عامیانه. We've got 5 discrete levels of Persian. How come we don't even get to level 4, محاوری گفتاری? It's an interesting question. It's almost diglossic. It's almost as if people have to learn 2 languages. Now, one of the reasons has to do with the nature of Iranian society. For 1,000 years, in order for you to succeed in the Persian language, you had to learn the Persian of the court. Like they say in English, speak the king's English. Well, the minute the printing press came to England, lots of people stopped speaking the king's English. Even Shakespeare in his plays, when ordinary people talk in Shakespeare's plays, they speak ordinary English. They don't speak verse. It's only when nobilities speak in Shakespeare's play, they speak poetry. Lots of people read Shakespeare, never pick up on this, but he was very conscious of it. Now, it so happens in 20th century America, I'm not talking 21st century, 20th century America, Robert Frost wrote the way he talked. That is, the gap between his idiolect and the formal language was very slim. Even Maya Angelou, and I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, in 1970, she's writing colloquially, but in terms of spelling, except for some idiomatic African-American expressions, there's no problem. Jalal al-Ahmad did as much as anybody to do something about this. In his prose, he uses colloquial sentence patterns, but not colloquial pronunciation of forms. So he may have lots of direct objects after the verbs. He may drop some prepositions. He may do the stuff that we do in colloquial spoken Persian, but he doesn't do the physical forms. Farrokhzad, she's carrying 1,000 years along with her. She has an individual voice. She chooses her own subject matter, so she's way ahead of everybody else, and is specific. And she loses the quatrain sequence. She loses strict adherence to the quantitative meters. She loses rhyme, except where she finds it important. But she doesn't take this last step. Now, online, in chat rooms and elsewhere, and my wife Sarah, when she writes letters, although not many people write a lot of letters anymore, when she writes letters, she writes in colloquial Persian. And we see lots of stuff in colloquial Persian. And I'm not talking about Iranian Americans of your generation and a little bit younger who have mixed feelings about formality in general and are going to throw in a lot of English words and be colloquial in general. I'm talking about people who have made a sort of shift because it just seems more natural. There's going to be a revolution. Well, that's not the revolution, evolution at some point. But the fact is, I was very careful when I gave talks in Persian at Iranian universities to make certain I didn't have one misplaced ra. I didn't have one preposition off. I didn't have one colloquial detail. Because half of the audience would say, Hillman doesn't know what he's talking about because he didn't say it in the right way. So everything was formal, and I didn't risk giving talks, academic talks in Persian without having a written text in front of me. I understand I haven't lived in, I've been to Germany a lot, but I haven't lived there. I understand in Germany, it's really important when you do something public in German that you use the higher level sort of German. But your question, you'd think these poets have wonderful ears. You think their ears would have told them by the 1960s onward to use colloquial Persian. However, on the other side, art is artifice. Art is artificial. It's an agreement we make, reader and writer. For example, I in some of the poems we're going to look at, I talk about poetic license. Do we give points to, or don't care about, or take away points if somebody uses ze as opposed to as? That is, if you use ze instead of as, you've said, I want to make this fit the rhythm. You've done something to language for the sake of something technical. I've always liked Johnny Cash a lot because he very rarely changes the word order in order to make a rhyme or the rhythm work. Some people say the song sounds like prose, but I don't think that's negative. But I just raise it in these materials as a question mark. Anytime somebody says Guyan instead of Miguyan, but meaning echbari, meaning indicative, I wonder, well, yes, the person did that in order to 19th century English poetry, where everybody agreed it was okay to move the direct object around, even though in English it changes the meaning to the subject, verb, object. They agreed that you had that license because rhyme was so important. The better question, the ultimate better question is when you hear Forugh reading your own poems, even though, except for the little poem, the poem about Ali, the kid, does her speaking voice come through? And I say it does, but it is artifice, and it's not the way she actually taught. Anybody else have a comment on this? I think it's really important for how Persian will survive in the United States in the 21st century. That is, whether the next generation will be encouraged to say it any way they want, to write it any way they want. Let's just get them writing. As communication is for the point to get across. Doesn't matter if you don't get it across the way Khalgani did. But that would have its own problems because half the people wouldn't understand what the person is saying. Anybody else on this?
I have a question, Dr. Hillman. Yeah. I just want to clarify what you said to make sure that I get the usage of the form. I think, as you mentioned, it's consecutive quatrain, right? And
quatrain sequence, yes, consecutive quatrain.
Right.
Quatrain sequence.
And it's kind of a traditional form. And so do you think we can say it is like a type of conformity to the traditions, because at the final line in last stanza, she is talking to herself and says, just stop being crazy. You know, it's like the conclusion of the whole poem is the speaker is talking to herself to stop her craziness and being more like a normal self in that society. So it's, again, she is changing herself, her crazy self, not saying, okay, this is me, just deal with me. So do you think these two things are related? The use of form, which is a traditional form, and the conclusion of the poem. It means at this stage of Frough's poetic life, she is still trying to be a part of the society and, you know, be inside the accepted box that society offers to artists or women.
I think you could be right in the latter regard, except that where was she going to go for a model or an inspiration to do things differently? She had crossed and burnt one bridge by being personal and specific as a woman. But where would she have gotten the inspiration to, at this point? She figured it out by the end in The Wall and other poems. Where would she have gotten the inspiration? And
So-
for example, and Shamlu, when Shamlu does Padiyal, that was exciting, and it was novel, and he was, of course, very tuned into folklore, knew a lot about it. But actually, with Padiyal, what he does is he puts this revolution that succeeded, that these fairies don't know anything about, he puts it in a Yekibud, Yekinabud colloquial format, which implies he thinks it's something that'll happen, that kids think will happen, but it's not going to happen for us grown-ups. He turns it into a fairy tale. That is, he's criticizing the fairies, but he presents us with a fairy tale. He doesn't think the Sohrabs are going to win. He thinks the Rustams are going to keep winning. He thinks with a crown or a turban and fathers in general, that's the way life is going to continue. If he hadn't thought that way, he might have used colloquial Persian, but used it in a more aggressive way. But then we come down to 1980 when he does that in Bombast, his famous poem about what life is like in the Islamic Republic, and it is very sophisticated in its formality, but he gets his point across. Where is this going to come up again? This is going to come, we're going to talk about this at length when we get to because in that poem we have a situation where colloquial may be called for and Forugh decides against it. Remember, one reason for doing things in a conventional way is more people will understand what you're doing. You're not selling your soul if you follow tradition. If you've got a larger audience and you follow tradition because of that, do as much as you can, but don't create two problems at the same time. Your new ideas and a new way of putting ideas. Barack Obama, when he talked to people on the south side of Chicago, used one English language that I was familiar with because I lived on the south side of Chicago. And we talked in Washington, he used another English language. And he made certain he didn't use that South Chicago language in Washington. That's just common sense. And we all in our lives, I've got 3 or 4 different Englishes I use. My English with my parents didn't have the word no in it. English in the locker room wasn't like Trump's locker room, but it was different from English on the street. And Iranians know this even better with the still useful Tarof system that helps people in certain situations. Let's turn to the last poem in this first PowerPoint. That would be the last 2 slides, please. The one before, one after that. Was all on one page? Yeah. جامعه ساکت، جامعه متروک، جامعه چون کوچه های کهنه غم‌انگیز، جامعه اندیشه های تنبل بیمار، جامعه خمیازه های موزی کشدار، جامعه بی انتظار، جامعه تسلیم، خانه خالی، خانه دلگیر، خانه در بسته بر هجوم جوانه، خانه تاریکی و تصور خورشید، خانه تنهای تفاعل و تردید، خانه پرده کتاب گنج تصاویر. چه آرام و پرغرور گذر داشت زندگی من، چو جویبار غریبی در دل این جامعه های ساکت متروک، در دل این خانه‌های خالی دلگیر، آه چه آرام و غرور گذر داشت. If I had written this poem, I would retire my NFL career on the following day. This is a classic example of poem with aesthetic distance, with a poem that uses sound to make and complement sense, a poem in which nothing about the form supersedes things about the experience that the speaker has in mind. And I've indicated some of the physical features of this to the left. That is all the repetition of sounds. If the word jolme appears in the poem 9 times, why? Because it's on her mind, and it's the second most important thing, or first most important thing in her life in this particular situation. The same with khoane. There's nothing decorative about this. Nothing. It's ijaz. It's concise. It's to the point. Let's take a quick look at it. Fridays. Actually, when I lived in Mashhad before I got married, I wanted Fridays to be saket. I had a busy week at the university, and guess what would happen on Friday? My students would show up at my room to be with me all day, so I wouldn't be alone. I got used to it after a week or two and kind of planned. But Fridays aren't quiet days on Friday, I remember. That is, those were the days where picnics, all kinds of things took place. Jomei and Matruk. I don't remember things being abandoned. Public spaces seem to be even fuller on Fridays. Jomei chun kuchahoye kohne qamangiz. Jomei was a Thursday night at the movies. Jomei, a bicycle ride to Sangbas, 32's. جامعه اندیشه های تنبل بیمار. اندیشه های تنبل بیمار. What kind of sick, lazy thoughts could a person have on Friday? Oh, by the way, I mentioned at the beginning, when I lived in Mashhad Friday, this Friday can only happen where? In a place where Fridays are the day off. Right? And poems in Persian, so my first guess is Iranian Fridays. اندیشه های تنبل بیمار. Unproductive thinking about things. Anything unproductive can be a sign of some sort of illness. Or let's say the تنبل بیمار, the thoughts could be about vague, uninformed, passing thoughts about sex. جامعه خمیازه های موزی کشدار. When you yawn in private, do you put your hand over your mouth? I do. I don't have to, but I know since I always did it from childhood. It just is an automatic reaction. So here's a polite person. جامعه بی انتظار. جامعه تسلیم. On the basis of the text itself, can we identify the person who is saying this, who is describing Friday in these terms? Go ahead.
Perhaps, I mean, although you just mentioned that that's our everyday life on a Friday, but maybe this is somebody who wasn't like us. Maybe somebody who was alone.
Okay, an exceptional person. If the person is atypical for the poem to work, should we get a glimpse at or an implication of that person's lack of typicality somewhere in the poem so we can appreciate the reality that that person experiences? Well, let's go on. That is, it's somebody who is not experiencing Friday the way Iranian teenage males of my acquaintance in Iran experience Friday. It's not the way Iranian college students, male or female, of my acquaintance, it's not how they participated in Fridays or what they thought of Fridays. Khane khali. Okay, it's Friday and the house is empty. When is the house empty? When there's nobody there, except the person who's composing the poem is there. Khane delgi, khane darbaste be hujum javani. The doors closed so that youth, so that the teenage world, so that sexuality maybe, don't get into the house. Anybody familiar with houses like that? Where the house was the kind of barrier so that things that happen outside wouldn't intrude. And were there any particular people in the house that this was especially relevant for? Junior, the male junior said, I'm going to go ride my bike in the alleys. Parents say, go for it. I want to go to the movies with my friends. Go for it. We're playing soccer at the end of the street. Go for it. It's March and strawberry ice cream is out at the local ice cream place. I want to go get some. Yes. Then his 12-year-old sister says, Mom, Dad, I want to walk around the neighborhood by myself. My girlfriends and I want to go to the movies. I'm talking about pre-1980. I'm talking about the 50s and 60s. There was one person in the family who might not have any place to go on Friday. The parents are visiting friends. The brothers are out with the other brothers. And maybe there isn't a brother of an age who will take his sister someplace or want to take his sister someplace. So we've got a whole country full of middle-class urban sisters for whom Friday, if there aren't organized family activities or anything related to school or anything supervised, they get to experience the house. Do we agree, or do you think I'm exaggerating?
I think someone who is single or divorced or whatever, not living with a family, can have really a Friday or an off day like this. And even, I don't know, when I was in Iran, most of the Friday evenings, Asr Jum'ah, they always had this negative heaviness that it was like a common knowledge that Friday evenings, they kind of are terrible. They just long.
I wish I had the experiences you had, but I'm 40 years, 50, 60 years too old. That is in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The minute I get here, I'm not thinking of college students, women college students, especially University of Tehran, University of Mashhad, University of Shiraz, Pahlavi University. I'm thinking unmarried teenage girls. And I can't find
what I see from her in this poem is most likely, I don't know, she was divorced or she was single, she was not in a relationship. That's how I relate to her.
Okay.
That's how I see her in this poem.
Your observation, another observation, right to the point here, we imagine all the possibilities and we're going to get funneled. We're going to get taken down to one street. Dreaming about what the future is going to be. Tardid, uncertain about what things are going to be. Khane parde, okay, kitab, ganjid, tasavir, and the last stanza. Che aram o purghurur guzar dasht. Zindagi man cho juybar qarib dar dil in jamhay sakit matruh dar dil in khanhay khali dilgir. Che aram o purghurur guzar dasht. She could have lowered the boom on Iranian society with this last stanza, a feminist thesis about how bad she was treated as an unmarried teenage person. Remember, she's now saying she's the grown-up, she's older now. But what she's saying is, and it's the truth of lives of many people, if your childhood isn't horrible, in retrospect, it seems pretty good. And that when you're going through it, even if there are these limitations, you make something of the limitations, your imaginary world, exchanging notes with friends, and such. So she has shown not just this formal modernity in this poem that works, but she shows that she also has aesthetic distance. She's not going to have her poems reach a point that she believed in Forugh de Pekar or Bechoharan, which we'll get to. This is how her life was. That when she was grown up, she looked back and said, oh, those were okay days. Dreaming about the future. There were still possibilities. Even though I didn't like being lonely, even though I didn't like the lack of opportunities to do things on Fridays. Soraya tells me in Matt Shadden when she was growing up, the girls sewed. There were 5 or 6 activities that they had. They couldn't go to the movies unless, and they did, they would sneak out at the movies and say they were somewhere else, or have a friend say they were at somebody's house. But the limitations they had, they didn't want to accept, but they had no power not to accept them. And they look back and think it was interesting just to be with a friend. It's sunny outside. You can't go anyplace, and using those burda patterns to make a dress or whatever. So here's where Farrokhzad ends up. This, of course, is almost a tad. It's very short, but this is where she's going to end up. She's going to be a person who understands aesthetic distance, understands how the shape of a statement should be subservient to the content of the statement, how form should have as much to say about the experience being communicated as anything else. And she also leaves out the editorializing. She just says, my life was, I think of my life now in that way. It was not an ideal situation. This is my formalist reading. There are some other readings.
Dr. Hillman, I saw both in this one and the last one that you presented. She also ends this one with a lesson, and she repeats it, that the one چهارم و پرغرور گذرداشت. I think she says, although I experienced all these things, the loneliness and all that, but I was proud, and I'm still okay. I'm still around.
I agree with that, but it's more like the Nader Pour lesson. She uses the evidence to reach one conclusion. If she were Gloria Steinem, she'd have had the first 2 stanzas, and the last stanza said, I'm now suing the school administration, my parents, and everybody else for cheating me out of lots of opportunities. That is, she uses the details, which could have gone in several different ways, and she honestly says, here's how I've turned out. It's not going to teach us anything, but it is a lesson about life. And for me, the sophisticated lesson is that your youthfulness and at 12 or 13 or 14 years of age, and your sense that things are going to turn out, that you have a future, your daydream about it, that's pleasure, that's fun. And she recollects in later life that she had those feelings at the same time. And she had a sense of individuality and pride and what have you. And maybe one last comment today. The other ingredient that we find her adding to the mix of the poetry she inherited is fardiyat, is individuality. That is, every poem we're going to read where we have a speaker, man, I, where we recognize that it's close to the life we think she led, it is going to be someone for whom individuality is a primary value. That helps somebody who has artistic talent because they'll stay true to that individuality as they pick a shape and they pick experiences to communicate to us. We were going to take a break between the first and second hour so that your ears could get a rest, but we didn't do that. Any critiques, suggestions for what we can do next time, and we'll stay very close to poems from here on in. We'll look at Asir, the poem we didn't get to next time, and move ahead.